Testing, testing, testing.
When I say we, I'm nearly always talking about Virginia Water Project, but I might be talking about the Community Action Agency Network, because we were born out of a Community Action Agency here locally. The network that we and the other rural water national, the RCAPs created, is what we call our national network. And there's, are you familiar with the RCAPs, the Rural Community? Okay. Yeah. So we have 7 states, and we have a lead agency in each state, almost all of which are community action agencies or were born out of, like the Beaufort-Jasper Comprehensive Health, JACA in North Carolina, the Maryland Rural Development Corporation in Maryland, a CAP in Delaware, because there's only one rural CAP, 2 rural counties. They have 500, what do they have? It's a huge territory, but Florida is a community action agency. Georgia, we had a real hard time in Georgia with the CAPs. So we work directly with the state.
Yeah, I noticed that. I was surprised at
that. Well, it's a long story, which we did everything I knew I knew how to do anything about, but it just, they're a different breed. If you want to know why, you're not going to quote me on this, why Jimmy Carter had problems in Georgia, in Washington, I didn't understand it at the time till I got
down there and started working
in a
different world.
They're different kind of people. They really are. Very strange. I don't mean, just, I can't figure it out still to this day. A lot of
is it an uncooperative spirit, or is it?
Very, I think it's bedrock. It's racism. But some of the good black cap directors get in. But that I think bedrock, they really haven't dealt with racism in the Community Action Agency network, but the same kind of behavior is what we saw in Washington with outsiders, this, but anyway, it's not that big a deal. I mean, I don't want to take up a lot of time on it because in the big picture it's not that big a deal, but it's like you say, what are some of your failures?
Yeah.
That has been a major failure in trying to break through that, the problems there. Although we're working, though, one of our best projects, one of the ones we're the proudest of, is in Keysville, Georgia, which was featured in had lots of national press, called The Town That Time Forgot, where this white family who ran the nursing home dropped the charter in 1932. They decided they weren't going to have a town anymore. And that story is just an incredible story. That woman,
this is
Emma Gresham, who's black, and Maxine Waller, who is white, are the prototypes.
So we should probably interview Emma Gresham.
If you could, it would be wonderful.
I thought about her at one point, and then I couldn't figure out whether it was rural enough.
It is rural.
It is rural, yeah. I couldn't...
Not only is it rural, when the first time I went there, now it looks a lot better than it did. The first time we went there, it was like 1935.
Yeah.
1935.
This is not that many years ago you were there.
Oh, I don't know, 4 years ago.
Right.
Oh, we were also depressed. I mean, we'd seen a lot of depressing. Yeah. But we wanted to be up because, see, we had brought them to Fentress, the community that started out pretty much like they did, just about as bad. And then, so then when we went to Keysville, well, Jackson Hall, a number of the staff people had been there, so they knew, but most of us hadn't. It was the hardest time I ever had to get myself up, because all I could feel was just, oh my God, there is no way there's nothing to be done. let's get out of town. No, I didn't feel that way, but it was just like, oh, God, this is beyond us. But I didn't count on the spirit of immigration and the people there.
I know I've been struck in Georgia. I mean, there's all this Atlanta, this city, this and that, and then you just go, several miles out, and there's this abject other world.
But to give you an example, to get at why I think we've had so much trouble in Georgia with the CAP network, is that here's this little town, had never had a daycare center. Didn't have any of the neighborhood youth corps, the summer youth corps, none of the programs that we'd never been in a community that hadn't had some of those programs, had not been just totally ignored by the CAP in Augusta. And so we started out thinking, well, maybe they didn't know about it. So we started out so friendly, and set up meetings. Nobody showed from Augusta. A lot of what I call profiling.
Yeah.
Like, the leadership thinks that's the center of the world.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's the only...
word.
I've got to just ask you a quick question about your art from
Okay, New Mexico.
Southwest. Are you particularly interested in that part of the
Yes.
country?
If I didn't have family in this part of the country, I would be making plans to
New
move
Mexico in particular?
to northern New Mexico. Not in Santa Fe, but some inexpensive place.
And is the wood carving from there?
Yes, you can pick it up, feel it. It feels so good. It is done. I went to a show. They did not want to do what we asked them to do, but it was awkward and hard. They weren't angry about it. They wasn't that. It was just, it was new. But it was good for them to think of things in a different way.
That's right. Well, that spurs a lot of new things that we do, too. In doing this, I thought maybe we could kind of do a combination of things. One is which kind of talk around your life and some of the influences in your life and some of the particular projects and like this whole issue of women in leadership is one that we're in the process of starting in this leadership program that we teach in a women in leadership section of it.
Yeah.
And we'd actually, at some later time, we probably ought to explore this and bring you down to Duke.
Well, Maxine's another one too who would
bring maybe the both of y'all down next fall sometime and talk with our students.
It'd be fun.
So that would be nice. So those are little topics that we want to talk about. But I thought maybe one way of doing it is to kind of do an autobiographical interview, so we can kind of talk through your life some, and we can interject and Neil just whenever you.
And if you want to move me faster, don't you will not hurt my feelings.
Okay.
I tend to go off on little side trips.
Okay, well that's all right. I mean, the side trips are usually the most interesting. It's when people have this tight little narrative that they're trying to take us down. That's when I get worried. But one of the things that we're interested in is the kinds of where people have gotten their kind of moral and ethical vision that have guided the work and the efforts that they've done. And a lot of that comes from people's backgrounds and their childhoods and their families. So I was thinking one way of just talking about this is to tell us a little bit about your family. Something about what you think is important about them, your mother, your father, your grandparents, things that were influential in your childhood.
Sure.
So you might just
and I've done a lot of thinking about that. I mean, I've lived long enough to think about those things.
Yeah. Well, in the South, you can't get away with
no.
those kind of things.
Although the most important thing to say is that I did not grow up in a typical Southern family. My mother and dad came to Virginia in 28, late 27, something. I was less than 2 years old, from Arkansas. My dad was a U.S. forester, and he was transferred to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. We lived in a little town of Broadway for about a year, and then he was transferred to Bridgewater, which is where my real roots of growing up are. But see, my father was an Abraham Lincoln Republican. growing up in this little southern town that did not have a single picture of Abraham Lincoln on its walls in the schools. It had Robert E. Lee and George Washington in every room. And I think in Bridgewater, in my growing up years, there were probably at the most 7 Republican families. All the rest were old Southern Democrats. It was a segregated town, of course. My mother and dad were wonderful people. I was blessed. Rarely, a lot of times you'll have one wonderful parent and the other okay, or even not so okay. But I was really blessed with 2 wonderful parents who were absolutely unified in their goal in life, and that was to raise us, to pass along their value system, to have a good time. We had company all the time. My dad he'd call my mother 11:30 during the middle of the week and say, so-and-so's here from Philadelphia. I thought I'd bring him for lunch. His office was in Bridgewater. And my mother never said, oh, it doesn't suit or anything. She just did it. And she could just turn out the best biscuits and things like that. And so I grew up in this house where everybody was welcome. Strangers were welcome. Friends are welcome. Everybody's welcome. There were 5 children. I was the youngest. On any given night, summer or winter, spring or fall, I'd say at least 3 of us had a friend sleeping over. We had this one friend, Hub Allen, who was a little older than I, but he stayed at our house a lot because he loved my brothers. They were older. And Ms. Allen would call 8 or 9 o'clock at night, many a night, and say, Miss Casey, is Hub over there? And Mother would look and say, Hub? And he'd say, yes. She'd say, are you spending the night? Yes. I mean, it's that kind of town. Totally safe. And when I wasn't sleeping in my own bed with a friend, I was staying with somebody. Yeah. And you could walk the streets of my friends, and I would decide at 10 o'clock at night, one or the other would spend the night. So we'd call, can so-and-so, can I spend the night? Yes, come home, get your pajamas. So we'd walk a quarter of a mile or more to your house to get, no fear, 11 o'clock at night. So I grew up in a safe environment. Also, something I know is different from a lot of people's experience. In that little town, there were 2 things. One, it was one of the headquarters for the Church of the Brethren. So a strong influence, and there were, people used to say there are more churches than people in Bridgewater. I mean, there were. But the Church of the Brethren, Bridgewater College is there. And we all went to Bridgewater College. Had a strong reason we went there is because that's all we could afford. But as it turned out, that was lucky for us because it's a first-rate liberal arts school. And so that's important. But the other thing that's very important is that the adults, the parents, genuinely cared about what happened to other people's children. So when you did well, not just in school, but if you did well in sports or did well in anything, everybody acted as if you were their child. And there was not the kind of competition that I saw a lot of when my kids were growing up. And it was genuine. And the parents, because Bridgewater didn't have a theater, we didn't have much to offer kids, the parents, especially the mothers, they started, we had dances at our house, moved all the furniture into one room and had dances. I remember my mother, and other mothers too, when we were about 14, began to have formal dinners for our crowd. Really? Yeah, yeah, service. Now, we didn't dress formally, we dressed up, but you know, they took us to Seawright Springs swimming pool every day in the summertime, mainly because they didn't want us swimming in the river. I mean, there was this wonderful, and I'm not unusual in how I talk about Bridgewater. All of us, as Hub said later to a friend, if you didn't grow up in Bridgewater, you didn't grow up. So I really had a very, very, very fortunate childhood. My father didn't. Now, my father was better than any of the rest in that he was easier. He didn't have a lot of rules. He wasn't stern, and he didn't believe that hard work makes kids good, you know. I don't think he ever asked me if I did my homework. He assumed I had done my homework. He only had a couple of rules, really. One was never lie. Now, of course, you know, you're going to lie anyway, but that was still, lying was about the worst thing you could do. Leave the world a better place than you found it. And never bet against the Yankees.
Pretty good rules.
Because if you bet against the Yankees, you're a damn fool. And that's almost as bad as lying. So, and my dad was on the school board. My mother was very active in all the things that women did in those days. They organized a women's club. They got a cafeteria for the local school. They raised money for things that the school system couldn't afford.
Had a very civic orientation.
Oh, very, very. And my dad, in Bridgewater, we had a black elementary school. Those kids, if they couldn't afford bus fare or didn't have some way to get to Harrisonburg to high school, that was it. That was the end of their schooling. And they also had a big pot-bellied stove in the middle of it that my dad worried. I can remember him worrying about that, talking to Mother about it. You know, he's just so afraid. He said every time the fire siren went off, he was afraid, when school was in session, that school had caught on fire. Well, he nagged the superintendent of schools for several years about the school system paying for those kids to ride the bus to school from the 7th or 8th grade on. He finally did get that done, and he finally got something, that pot-bellied stove, removed. But, and he, like, we had this woman that worked for Mother, 50 cents a day. That's what the going rate was. He paid her double and swore her to secrecy because he knew the other women in town would just, you know, everybody. But even then, he said he always felt guilty about that, you know. You know, I mean, $1 a day was...
It was nothing even.
But they were not firebrand world changers in the sense of, you know, there wasn't this kind of self-righteous indignation. It was just they, and at our dining room table, lunch and dinner was free-for-all conversation about everything. And he always encouraged me. I was the youngest. I remember when I first began to take part, the others would say, "Shut up, Wilma Jean, what do you know?" And Dad would say, "Let her talk." Well, I didn't know anything, but I... And I remember when I got married, I married into a typical Southern family. And I remember early on, Mr. Warren loved to talk politics. And I did too. And he began to talk politics at the dining room table one Sunday, and Francis said, "Now, Jim, you know we don't talk about religion or politics at the table." And I can remember thinking, oh my God, what do they talk about?
Those things are outlaws.
But I was, to some degree, a stranger in a foreign land. I always knew I didn't quite belong. Like my 5th grade teacher, she was on her 3rd generation of kids. And she just sort of ignored me because she didn't teach my parents or my grandparents. But I didn't care because I didn't like her anyway. I mean, she was so mean to the poor kids. So I didn't care. But I knew she didn't like me because I hadn't lived there forever. And I always knew I'm not a Southerner. I couldn't figure it out. And I was 36 or 7 years old and went to Little Rock to a meeting. Walked in the old Marion Hotel lobby, and it was just mobbed with these sheriffs from all over the Southwest. Big hats, boots, badges, guns, which I hated guns, you know, why would I like these guys? God, I loved them. I wanted to hug and kiss every one of them. It was the voices. And I said to the person, I was with Bristow. We were at a community action, some sort of a regional meeting. I said, oh, my God, you will never believe what's happening to me. He said, what? I said, I know who I am. He said, what are you talking about? I said, I'm a Southwestern. I knew I wasn't a Southerner, but I didn't know what I was. And that's the first time I had any idea how important voices are to us. Oh, my. And Maxine and I have talked about that. That's why I'm so attracted to the Appalachian people and communities, because my generations grew up on the Ozarks. You know, so, and even though I have not really been around Appalachian people much in my lifetime, I am immediately attracted to them. I feel most at home. I feel like when I go to Ivanhoe this summer for a week, I'm going home for a week. And a lot of it comes from voices.
You know, earlier in the car, you mentioned that one of the things that is most kind of distinctive about the work that you're doing and that Mary is sort of taking the lead on doing is this sense about that people are equal, that whether you're speaking with someone who's very poor or more influential, that we're all kind of human beings and that this is a fundamental attitude or spirit or core of this network in some way. As you were sort of talking about your home earlier, about, you know, kids coming over and spending the night and your mom always be willing to kind of open the door and cook biscuits, or that's also the spirit of sort of hospitality. Are there?
Definitely. Well, that's what the Casey coat of arms is, the outstretched hand with the sheaf of wheat in it. And yeah, and my family was proud of that. I mean, that was not just an unstated norm, that was a norm. And as kids, we gave up our beds for visitors. That's a mailman. And we're expected to. I mean, it was no hardship. We had to sleep on the floor in one of the others' rooms. We did that. I mean, that wasn't unselfish. That was just what you do because you want people to have a good time in your home and feel. But the other is, my mother had a snobbish streak, which she got from her grandparents in Arkansas. But my dad was the leveler of that. You know, he just, if my mother, like sometimes I'd have a friend that mother didn't approve of. Usually, though, it was their behavior she didn't approve of. She was not a snob in the sense of how much money do you have, but it was behavior. But my dad would say, now, meaty, and that'd sort of be it. And, but we definitely got it from our father and mother, but more our father than our mother.
And how important, so I guess it's sort of a retrospective question, how important was it in retrospect now when you're sort of looking back on what you've accomplished and what you've been part of, was those conversations at your dinner table, the free-for-all political conversations, and your dad saying, now let Wilma Jean speak her mind, how important was that?
Extremely. The inclusive attitude. I've always hated exclusivity. Like growing up in a town that was segregated. Always hurt me. Always hurt me. I knew it was wrong. From the time I had the earliest memory, like going to the post office. During the war, they put the mail up 3 times a day, and everybody would come to the post office and wait for them to put the mail up. And the blacks would kind of hover over in one corner, almost like they didn't have any right to be inside the building. And they had sons that were in battle, and then they'd wait till the last to ask for their mail. You know, it just, I hate it. The other thing, this is the thing, one of my most vivid childhood memories if you, like my friends, say 2 or 3 of us walking down the sidewalk, and a couple of little black children walking behind us, just by coincidence. No, if they'd be walking in front of us and we'd be walking, they'd stop and look. Stop and look, stop and look. Well, my friends thought that was funny. I never thought it was funny. I mean, it was like there was something wrong with them, that they, object of derision. Well, we were never allowed to use the word nigger in our house.
Well, that's a big...
Yeah, never, ever. But we also weren't allowed to bring home movie magazines or true story magazines either. Daddy would say, now I know you can read them, I can't keep you from reading them, but I don't want them in this house. And he said, and it's not because they have anything to do with sex or, it's not the content matter. It is that they are such terrible grammar. They're written so poorly. He didn't want us to read it. Of course, I read them at other people's houses, but it didn't take me long to realize they were very boring. So, but
that's a good influence. One thing I was wondering is that this work that your father did in the forest, did that play any kind of impact on?
I didn't realize it.
You've gotten into,
I didn't realize that
like an obvious one by one.
till years later.
Uh-huh.
Some of my earliest childhood memories. My dad loved his work. So he worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. 5 days a week, sometimes 6. That was in the days when the Forest Service was building the lookout towers. Like, he took us to spend a night in a lookout tower, one of my earliest memories when we first came, of that he had helped build. Then they were building the camps, during the days of the CCC. So they were building the campsites and that sort of thing. What did we do on Sunday? We all went out to see what they'd done the week before. And so we spent a lot of time stopping at the fire warden, because that's the way I learned a lot about networking and didn't even think about it. Because the whole system of fire protection depended on these fire wardens. And he'd stop by and chew the fat, and we'd all get out, and he'd introduce us, and he would shake hands, and we'd all shake hands, and he did, And Daddy treated everybody the same. There's no question where I got that from. And it wasn't phony. It was he truly, and I believe that it's awesome in the sense of fearful for me to think I am somehow better than somebody else. That's not to say I don't recognize I have skills that somebody else doesn't have. They have skills that I don't have. But I really believe that's the greatest sin against God. Does it set you up for a fall? Even if I didn't believe it, the consequences to me are so nuts that anyway. But definitely getting to know the people in the mountains. And they came to our house all the time. My God, at Christmas and Thanksgiving, hunting season, they came by, they brought venison, they brought bear, they brought deer. My mother never learned how to cook the deer or the bear. But they brought pond hoss. You know what that is? Well, it's something they make when they butcher hogs that my daddy loved. My mother, you slice it and fry it. My daddy loved it. Somebody always brought us a Christmas tree. One year, somebody brought one that took up about almost a fourth of our living room. My mother just raising hell, we're not going to use it. My daddy said, yes, we are now. Mr. Howdishaw brought it. And it was so big, my daddy had on his desk at the office, you're now entering George Washington National Forest. He brought it home and put it under the Christmas tree. So And they called on the phone all the time. During the CCC days, my daddy was a social worker as well. Those guys were so homesick.
Yeah.
And on Friday nights and Saturday nights, they called our house nonstop to talk to Daddy. Just because they couldn't go home but ever so often. And they'd call and cry. Grown men cry. My daddy would sit at the phone and cry. It just killed him. He said one of the most touching things was he was in charge of the Camp Roosevelt, the first CCC camp to open up near Front Royal. And he said one of the young men was the son of one of his fire wardens who had gotten married to this young girl because she was pregnant. And he didn't have a job, so he went to CCC camp. And Daddy said he went up there the first payday. And he said they were all so happy, first pay for work they'd had in God knows how long. And he said this young man came up to him with tears in his eyes and said, "Mr. Casey, you see," I don't remember how much it was, $30 or something. He said, "You see this?" He said, "You know what I'm going to buy with this?" And he said, "No." "What are you going to buy?" And he said, "I'm going to buy a baby carriage for that baby of mine." So, yeah, it did have influence on me.
So did you spend a lot of time in the outdoors? I mean, like the natural environment?
Yeah.
Obviously, you go up. So you were kind of aware of how all the kind of importance of the ecosystem and that.
Oh, yes. Yes, and see, my dad, that I remember when my oldest son was a baby, 3 years old, I guess. During fire season, we were in Bridgewater. And Daddy, during fire season, would go around to the hunting lodges and just check in and say hello and, don't y'all forget to be careful. And as we drove around those mountains, it was on the Dry River District of the GW, we were way up in the mountains, just everywhere you look mountains. And my daddy, Frank and I were sitting in the back seat, and Daddy was in the front seat. Daddy said, he had long arms. He said, "Frank," he said, "you see those trees out there?" And Frank said, "Yes, Granddaddy." He said, "Who do you think planted those trees?" And Frank would say, "I don't know, Granddaddy." He said, "Your Granddaddy planted those trees back in 1930, whatever, or 40, 30-something. So, yeah. But I didn't even think about that because it took me a long time to get into recycling.
Confession, I'm sure a lot of us do. What about the New Deal? That seems like another...
Oh, well, my daddy he hated Franklin Roosevelt because, see, he was a Republican.
Right.
I always told my dad, when he'd come, he remarried after my mother died. He went back to Arkansas and met a childhood sweetheart and remarried and moved back to Arkansas. But he'd come and stay a month every year, and we would argue the whole time because by that time, I had become an out-and-out Democrat. Well, he never forgave me for it. Because he didn't ever really see the difference between the kind of Republican he was and the kind that had taken over with Nixon.
Yeah.
And he said I was brainwashed by the preachers. I said, "No, Daddy, I wasn't. I just happened to see Richard Nixon the night in, L.A. when he said, 'You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore.' Late night television, and I said, that man is sick. I said, that man is sick, never dreaming he was going to be president. So
he was there wasn't, you didn't grow up in this kind of strong New Deal thing.
No.
Just the opposite.
No, now he was probably the least sexist man I ever knew. Like, he and Mother had the same checkbook. He never said, "What'd you buy? What'd you spend that for?" or anything. The only time they ever argued about the checkbook was if one of them would write a check and forget to enter it. And whoever it was would bitch at the other one and say, "Why didn't you tell me?" But he expected the same thing of my sisters that he expected of our brothers. There was never any question, like the girls don't get to go to college, as happened to a lot of young women in the 30s. But no, not the New Deal. Although, yes, he approved of the CCC camps.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Oh, yes, he approved of that.
Because you have all these programs, particularly the National Forest, and that's one.
Right.
That area is one of the major beneficiaries. Started the Parkway, the Blue Ridge Parkway.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Daddy worked on that. I mean, he supervised a group of work people up there. And he said years later, see, they discovered up there. You know, Carl Sandburg came up there and wrote that book, Backwoods America. He talked to the people, recorded. See, they found people who spoke pure Elizabethan English when they were building the Parkway. And, of course, changed their lives completely.
Yeah.
And my daddy, when he'd talk about it years later, he'd just shake his head and he'd say, worst mistake we ever made. We didn't do those people any favors.
Yeah, that's probably true.
I don't know if it is, or, but he also, in later years of his life, wasn't sure that, he wasn't serious, but I think he was, that he wasn't so sure that the war with England was the good thing. He wasn't an Anglophile, but what he worried about was the Canada and the U.S. That it's too bad we weren't all one country. I don't know. I don't think anyway. But I became a liberal, a real liberal over desegregation. I mean, that's what formed my adult behavior.
Before we get to that, maybe a little bit about, you said you went to Bridgewater.
I just went 1 year. And that was a big disappointment to my mother and father, too. I was the only one who didn't graduate. But I got a job in Harrisonburg one summer in a music store. And I was in charge of all the phonograph records and decorated the windows and the sheet music. And I had a man and wife who owned it, Mr. and Ms. Miles, who didn't have any children, who adopted me and gave me just free rein to be as creative as I could be. And they were incredible. Like 5% of all sales could go into advertising. So I wrote a classical music 1-hour radio show every week, all the narrative for it, a country music one for Saturday morning, and a popular one.
Wow.
It was a wonderful life, and I kept saying, well, I'm going to quit and go back to school, but I just didn't do it. Then the war was over, and I got married. And we moved to Stanton, and I kept the same job. Until we moved to Richmond several years later. But Bridgewater College was an enormous influence in my life. And across the street from us, we lived in a big old turn-of-the-century white clapboard house with gingerbread and a 2-turret attic. That was the other thing. So you could get up there and see the whole town. It was filled with books. And I'd go up there, and Daddy would disappear sometime. Somebody would say, where's your mother? Say, where's your father? And we'd say, we don't know. Well, we'd go to the attic door and holler up, and Daddy'd be up in the attic reading and looking out over Bridgewater. And we all did it. And the people across the street lived in a similar house, the Minor C. Miller family. And he was the secretary of the Virginia Council of Churches with headquarters in Bridgewater. His brother helped form and was the first head of the National Council of Churches. These two brothers grew up near Weir's Cave, Virginia. And Church of the Brethren, Quentin Miller was the other one's name. They had, Minor C had 8 children. We had 5, so there were 13 children there. And so they were our neighbors and friends, even though we weren't Church of the Brethren. And during the war, their son Myron, whom everybody in town just loved, he'd been a pet of the town. He decided to become a conscientious objector. He was in college; he wasn't finished. And this was a watershed experience in my life too. And the way he was treated by the people of that town who had sons in the service it was terrible.
Yeah.
It was just terrible. Like when he'd go to the grocery store, they wouldn't wait on him. It was terrible. He was shunned.
Yeah.
It was a real shunning.
Yeah.
And my father was so horrified at that. And, you know, you can't go storming up and down the street and say, stop this. This is terrible. What are you doing to this kid? And this was not easy. It wasn't easy for him to make that decision. And so that was my first real experience, although the Millers always had blacks in their home. He had been to World Council of Churches meetings. They had people from Europe, from around the world visit them. So that was an exposure to me that an average kid in a southern town isn't going to have. And but the big thing was, I didn't even think of what Myron did as being an act of pacifism. You know, it's just that he had the right. He was an American, and he had the right to make that decision. And at the time, I didn't realize how important that was to me. But as years went on, and then when the Vietnam War came along,
it's a much harder thing to do in World War II.
Oh yeah. But it helped me think through that whole thing. And World War II, I supported it, and I think I would again under the circumstances. Given, that picture I got in Poland, that is old Warsaw, where World War II started, on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon when the Nazi planes strafed innocent people there, just leveled that place. And I hate it. I don't, I think, but it's when I first began to think, look, there got to be better ways for the human race to solve conflict than war. It's not a simple issue, but it had a big influence on me. That whole. Hello, Cindy. Come here, Cindy. Our family was. My dad always said we were hard up. Well, it was 5 kids trying to put them through college. And he didn't make a whole lot, but he made more than a lot of people, and it was good, steady work. But in thinking about, and I have thought a lot about it, in thinking about poverty and the effects of poverty on children, and then as they become adults. I really believe that parents who share a common cause of raising a family with a set of values that include forgiveness, have high expectations, but also don't, you can't, it's never too late, sort of philosophy, who believe in your word is as good as your bond, that are dependable. Like, Dad and Mother didn't expect us to be the brightest student or make the best grades. They just expected us to do our best. But a lot of times parents say that, but what they really mean is do better than your best. Exceed your best. It wasn't like that. And but especially parents who, by their actions, are giving to others outside the family, in their community, to their neighbors. I went through a period during the 60s because I really felt betrayed by my peers on the issue of race. The way my friends would explain where I stood was I was different. and I'd say, I'm not any different from you. I'm not privy to any information that you aren't privy to. You have the same responsibility to open your mind that I do. And I personally, my friends didn't drop me, but the way they dealt with it was, you're different. And somehow or another, that was just nuts to me. It was a cop-out. So I stopped going to church for about 10 years. After Martin Luther King was killed, my clergyman, who was wonderful, Dick Beasley, suggested that everybody who wanted to make a witness meet at St. John's Church, which is right downtown, and walk together to the other church where they were going to have a memorial service for Martin Luther King. And so lots of us at TAP came, blacks and whites, and except for Dr. Beasley and his wife and Bob Bondurant and his wife. Bob Bondurant's an MD here in town who's just an incredible guy. Nobody else from St. John's Church was there. Well, shortly after that, coincidentally, Dick Beasley died one Sunday right after church with a heart attack, and I just said, look, I felt really, I didn't want to give my money to the institution. I was wrong, but, and when I went back because I realized I needed to hear the Word of God on a regular basis and to join in worship. And I'm glad I do, but I've never let myself get quite as involved as and that's one thing I'm having to watch now.
Yeah. When
the only person who articulated that was this man who was and when we lived in Richmond, he'd been our next door neighbor. And we went back there to visit one weekend. And, when we all got together, that's what we talked about. I don't know about you. Yeah. That's what we talked about and argued about. And I remember John Prophet said to me, we were all sort of like in the kitchen, nobody else had heard it. He said, I want you to know I really admire you for taking the stand you take. But he said, I can't afford to do that. He said, I'd probably lose my job. I said, John, I think you'd be surprised that you wouldn't lose your job. He said, well, I can't risk it. So I really think a lot of that had to do with it was their perception of what would happen. I don't think enough people were willing to test the reality of it, frankly. Because really about most of the people who did lose their jobs were clergymen. Who's, that's one of the reasons I left the church for 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's true. Particularly among the middle classes in the South, they were so frightened. And I could never, I grew up in that world too, and I could never quite figure out what it was they were frightened of, or what they thought was going to happen.
I think they were afraid of being shunned, like what happened to Myron Miller.
Yeah.
I
think that's true. The social world.
They talk about it in economic terms. I'm afraid I'll lose my job, but I don't think that was it.
Yeah,
I think there's too much at stake in their social life. But I know one Saturday in about '66, we had friends who were black who would come to visit us when we lived up the street from here and then here. Not too many, but a few we knew through the church. And one Saturday, though, I had worked that Saturday. I was working at TAP then, and we were working on the legal aid grant application. I want you to know I wrote the first legal aid grant application that was funded in the state of Virginia. Yeah, I'm really proud of that. I had a lot of help, but I was the person who did the writing. Anyway, these guys from Washington were here who were consultants. One was black and one was white. So they had picked me up that morning, but it was early in the morning. They brought me back that afternoon about 4, and I said, y'all come in and have a drink. I want you to meet my family. When we got here, the street was just filled with kids playing kick the can or something like that. And when we got out of the car, it was just like this camera in my head, this we got out of the car, and when that black guy got out of the car, every kid there stopped what they were doing except my children. And my children were just natural. I mean, you know, but it was like, really?
What's going on there?
Like frozen in time.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, well, these kids need to see more, more black folks. Yeah.
What was the world, and I mean, without going into much detail, I'm kind of interested in how you make the transition out of the world that you're in before you start working at the TAP and work for the schools and stuff. Figuring out what brings you into this more activist role, the kind of people that are influential, and just kind of how you.
I was very, very involved in the Episcopal Church during those days, and there were a lot of priests, but there were also a lot of lay people who fought the segregation. There were also a lot who were fighting the integration too, but I couldn't, and when we moved to Roanoke, I didn't feel I had, I mean, we got involved in the church, but it wasn't until Bishop Marmion, he came here about the same time I did, and about 2 years afterwards, he just by fiat, which he had the power to do, declared that Hemlock Haven, our camp conference center, would be desegregated. And her father was his assistant, Bill Ridden, Episcopal priest. And he and the bishop were very influential in my life at that time. Because I felt for the first time I have a ground to stand on. I have a ground to stand on this issue. And that has some substance, it has some reality to it. And so there was...
this would have been in the early 60s or 50s?
Late 50s.
Late 50s.
Early. Late 50s and then into the... Then all through the 60s.
Yeah.
And people pretty much, I mean, it really did... It tested my ability to stand where I stood, but not be angry and not... Now, a lot of times I was angry. I mean, I was real angry. But not to act that out in a way that was destructive.
Yeah.
That's the first time I'd really ever had to do that. And then there was a crowd of us, her parents and about 8 couples that used to get together after church every Sunday. And all the kids get together, and we'd have coffee and cinnamon toast, and kids would be all over the house. We'd go to different people's houses, and where we really talked about not just segregation, desegregation, but a lot of things of spiritual importance, but as it had to do with the political scene. For instance, we had this Episcopal priest who was supposed to come to Roanoke to our church. We helped start a new congregation. And we had this guy named Jim Jones from Chicago that one of our crowd had just happened to go to this church when he was at a business meeting in Chicago, and heard this guy preach. And so he stayed afterwards and said, you know, do you ever do preaching missions? And he said, yes, I do. And so Charlie came back, and we arranged to have Jim Jones come to do a preaching mission. Well, 2 weeks before the preaching mission, Jim Jones was on the bus of Freedom Riders.
Oh, wow.
And out was Alabama, yeah.
Alabama, Mississippi.
And I'll never forget, Charlie came by my house one day. See, I hadn't made the connection, because all these guys were in the paper. Charlie came by my house, and he was really surreptitious, and he said, Wilma, he said, we've got a problem. I said, what's that? He said, you know, this Jim Jones is coming to our preaching mission? And I said, yeah. He said, well, he's in jail in Birmingham. He said, I've heard from his church, and they want to know, they say that Jim said it's perfectly all right to cancel the mission if we want to, because he realizes he'd be a controversial figure and doesn't want to. Charlie said, "What do you think?" I said, "We can't." I said, "My God, Charlie, we can't cancel him if he's out of." He said he's also wasn't sure he'd be out of jail. I said, "We can't cancel." I said, "My God, everything we stand for." I said, "We can't." And Charlie said, "Well, that's the way I feel." Well, anyway, he came, and he was very controversial, but he was wonderful. And later, Bristow Hardin hired him to come to work at TAP. He worked at TAP for about 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
As doing doing organizational work. And so we were involved in a lot of stuff like that. Writing letters to the editor and sort of being gadflies. We were more gadflies than big.
You have a little crew. It sounds like you probably have a little crowd of people.
Oh, yeah.
Then,
Man, we went to Washington, not for the big march. Later, this is a little later because this is when I was working at West End School. We went to Washington for the march where up to the Washington Monument when Coretta King, that was after Martin Luther King was killed, when Coretta King spoke. And we did some things like that. But we were more gadflies in the community than anything else. But supporters of the bishop and the clergy in the church. That was an important role, probably the most important role we played. I don't think we changed a lot of minds. I think the most single important thing that happened was the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
Did Roanoke, was there a big, I don't remember what the fight in Roanoke was over desegregation of schools. It probably took place later, actually.
It did.
I grew up in Greensboro.
Yeah.
So really, there was some kind of token desegregation, but really, it's the late 60s before there was any kind of... Mid to late 60s before there was much significant...
Right, exactly. Because, my daughter graduated from high school in the first class that had black students. She graduated in 71. And so it was 68, 67 in the senior high school. Now, they had them in the elementary. In fact, Bristow's elementary school, West End School, was the first school in the city to desegregate. And that was 63, 62. And they had Life magazine, Time magazine, all of them. What he did was he brought the black students in. 10%, let me see, I think there were 10 or 12 of them. He lied to the press about what day they were coming. And so they came a day before he said they were coming. And he absolutely would not let the press come across the street and get close to the kids. He was a big guy. You've read about him. He's this big, burly. He looked like a typical Southern sheriff. I mean, he was a prototype of the worst racist looking you could ever imagine. But he just had such a force of his personality that he cowed those photographers and reporters. And so it was a non-story by the time they realized he had he really had pulled the wool over their eyes. And that school, and see, that's the school I worked in for 2 years.
When did you go to work there? Or
I went to work there in 63. And
had you been working before?
No.
Or you've been raising your kids?
Right.
Yeah.
And we had 4 kids, and we simply had to have more money.
Right.
And there was an opening at the diocese. I was going to go to work for one of the men, not Bill Reardon, but the other guy, Director of Christian Education. And Bristow called me, and he said, "Why didn't you tell me you were looking for a job?" And I said, "I thought I did." And he said, "Dorothy Eichenberry has just called and said she's got a teaching job." That was his school secretary. He said, "I want you to come to work for me." And I said, "Bristow, I've sort of made a commitment to Bob Thomas." And he said, "Hell with that." Well, I made about half the money, but he just. The story of one of the influences, one of the major one is Bristow, who simply, it was easier to say, okay, I'll do it, than to fight. And I'm normally not like that. But it's just he was such a powerful personality, and managed to also make the job sound like it's just going to be so wonderful you'd be crazy to miss it. And as it turned out, it was even better. So yeah, working at West End School was a good experience. It was a wonderful experience. But it was the first time I had been in a school where it was desegregated in my lifetime. And so...
Were there a lot of problems around that? Or?
No, but there would have been more, I guess, if it hadn't been for Bristow.
I think that's true in a lot of other places.
No, Bristow acted it out. You know, the acceptance. He was very playful. He had an MFA in drama from the University of Texas. And so he was always on stage. We'd save anything that came in the mail in those rollers, And he kept a supply of them, and on a bad weather or something, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he'd start up and down the rooms. He'd take 2 of them, and he'd walk into a classroom, 3rd graders, and sling open the door, and he'd say, "Miss Penny, on guard," and throw her the thing. And they'd fence all over the room, up on top of the desk. And he'd get her almost down, he'd almost get her. And he'd say, "I'm going to get her." And they'd say, the kids would say, "Oh, Mr. Harden, please let Miss Oakey go. She's the best teacher we ever had." And finally he'd say, "Okay, only because the children want you to survive." And so the only racial problem we had was this one father there was this wonderful little boy named Jerome. He's bound to have been, he must have been from he was black and shiny. He was gorgeous. He had to be from royalty somewhere. I mean, stood straight as an arrow. He had seen his father commit suicide in his backyard when he was about 4 years old with a gun. But he was so proud and smart as a tack. And he had this big crush on this little blonde-headed, curly-headed girl. And wanted to sit beside her, had nothing to do but sit beside her. And Penny put him beside her, first, but then as most teachers during the year, you move the kids around so they socialize with each other and don't get into little cliques. Well, the day she moved, he wasn't going to move. I mean, it was a crisis. He had got a haircut one weekend in the spring when it was getting pretty hot. And the barber just almost shaved his head. He came to school in a little jacket with a hood. He wouldn't take his hood off because he was so embarrassed. And anyway, this little girl's father called the office one day and said, "I want to speak to Mr. Harden." So I put Bristow on, and he talked a long time. Bristow came out, and his eyes big. He said, "I don't know if this guy's a nut or not, but he says he's coming to see me tomorrow. He wants to talk to me, and he said he's bringing a gun." I said, "Oh, my God, Bristow." I said, "What are we going to do?" And Bristow said, I told him I'd see him. I said, "Well, that just scares the hell out of me." He said, "Oh," he said, "he's not going to. I don't think." He said, "Don't worry." Well, of course I worried. Well, our offices were on the 2nd floor of this big old school, and I could see anybody that came up the steps, and I saw this guy come up the steps that next afternoon. My heart. I really was terrified. And because violence was not unknown in that community. And so when I walked out to meet him and spoke to him and shook his hand, I could smell alcohol. And I said, he's got a drinking problem. This is part of the problem. So I took him in. Bristow greeted him, shook his hand, said, "Come on in, Mr. So-and-so." And they stayed, and they stayed, and they stayed with the door closed. Every minute I was sure I was going to hear a gun go off. Well, in a little while, out they came, Bristow with his arm around this guy. The guy saying, "I'm sorry I bothered you, Mr. Harden." He said, "I'm sure everything's going to be all right." And Bristow walked him to the door, came back. I said, "God almighty, what was that about?" And he said, "You know what that was about?" He said he came in saying he didn't want his daughter sitting by any nigger. He said what the real problem was, he finally told me he couldn't read or write. And his little girl is smart, and she's in the 3rd grade, and he knows she's going to find out he can't read and write. And he didn't know what to do about it. That was a big learning lesson for me, too. So that was the biggest racial incident we had. But see, we had elementary kids.
Yeah,
You're not going to have a lot of that problem.
Well, he sounds like a wonderful human being. I talked about him sword fighting on the desk. I tried to imagine, would they even permit, with all these rules and regulations today? I mean, if a principal were to do that today, I wonder if he would even be able to keep doing her job.
Oh, they didn't want to permit him to do it in those days.
Yeah.
As the superintendent said, Bristow, every school system needs somebody like you, but only one. But he was way ahead of his time.
Yeah.
Everybody loved him. Kids came back to the school all the time.
To visit him?
Yes, a little bit, please. And when we would often, we'd get to school on Monday morning, there'd be anywhere from 8 to 20 mothers, grandmothers, and children waiting to see Mr. Hardin, to have him arbitrate the conflicts of the weekend. Because, see, what we didn't recognize then, which now is so obvious, that was the beginning of the time of the women heads of household. The men, they were marriages breaking up, or the men away, traveling, driving trucks, or and most of the people, not the blacks, but most of the white students were 1st and 2nd generation Appalachian people, migrated to Roanoke, finding it hard, being isolated. We had, the other thing, we had many, many mothers. Most would send their kids to school with measles, mumps, chicken pox, and call or with a note saying, "You see those spots? Or Johnny has. Do you know what this is?" So we'd take the kid home and tell him what it was, and call the school nurse or take them to the health department. That was a wonderful experience, those 2 years at West End. Rare. I mean, I don't want to take any more time, but there are just so many stories, and I learned so much from Bristow about how to... The important thing about Bristow was he never stopped being a child. You know, the playful side of Bristow, which I needed, because I always tend to be a serious kind of person. I can get into my head, and problem solve. But he understood that. I guess he learned that. He may have always known it, but certainly in drama, that's one of the things, is the importance of comedy, the importance of laughter. That's right. That's right.
But it sounds like you were already beginning through your 2 years here at the school to learn about
Oh, yes.
families
Oh,
splitting
yes.
up.
I've got plenty.
Kids coming to school with illnesses that their moms didn't know what the problems were. Was this in any way the genesis of
No question. No question. I was ripe. I had no idea. I had lived in Roanoke 10 years when I went to work there, 12 years. I had no idea what city poverty was like. See, I'd lived out in the suburbs. I was completely isolated from it. And the first time I went with Bristow to take a child home, we went into this awful, horrible building. It was originally, I guess, 4 apartments, maybe 6, I can't remember. It looked like it had not ever had a coat of paint, ever. I can smell to this minute the smell of that building. Yeah. Like cooked cabbage, dirty clothes. I tell you, and it just knocked me down. And we went in, and the child lived upstairs, and there's this long stairway of just these walls. It didn't even have a color. I started to say gray. It wasn't gray. It was just no color wall with this awful smell, and the mother wouldn't come to the door. We knew she was in there. We could hear her. But whether she had a man friend or whether she just didn't want to be bothered, we couldn't cope or what. And we had to take the child back to school and call the city, somebody to come and to get the mother to open the door. That was a big shock. Because I had thought in terms growing up in Bridgewater of poverty as black people were poor. I never recognized that the mountain people were poor. I never did. I knew we had some poor white families in Bridgewater during the Depression, but the other families helped them. I never really was sensitive. One of my best friends told me years later that she dreaded Christmas because the church brought them Christmas baskets. And see, I had a bias that I didn't understand then about poverty. You know, it was like, oh yeah, but you weren't really poor. And they weren't, compared to the blacks, I mean, who lived in dirt floors in those days, a lot of them. So.
And this is a white family you're talking about.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Actually, many of the black children who went to West End, once it was fully desegregated, were some of the middle class black families.
That's usually in the early.
And that was by plan. That was by plan.
Yeah.
And the other big learning I had was after I went to TAP and got to know. I can remember. I had a very life-changing experience in the 50s at a church conference thing. It was the introduction of experiential education in the diocese. And I really had a life-changing experience, and I realized that I was heading down the wrong direction. I was becoming Ms. Ann. I didn't like that a bit. And I can remember being at a church conference. There were a few blacks there. I mean, the only place you ever saw blacks socially was in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
But that wasn't many. We were all these white folks sitting around in the living room of this very nice home at night singing with our hands crossed, "We shall overcome." And I can remember thinking, wait a minute, this is not, there's something wrong with this picture. And I vowed I would never sing that song again until I knew some black people as peers, you know, and I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it, and I didn't. And that's one of the things that took me to TAP, because I knew that was going to be really desegregated. And it was at that point that my friends, the people, not my friends so much, some friends in my own church, we were the first integrated group of workers in the city.
Yeah.
Now, there was one before us, the YWCA, but it was so small nobody even knew it. But TAP was it became the lightning rod. And when we go, and we'd all go out to lunch together, there's this one wonderful restaurant, the Frontier, they're closed now, who never blinked an eye. There was never any question we'd be served. You know, where we were, I mean, it was just incredible when you think about it. But I'd have people from my church, not close friends, but I remember sitting in that restaurant at a table with blacks and whites, and several different people in my church coming by and say, "Hi, so-and-so," and I realized they weren't going to speak to me. They just went right out there. So I said, "Well, good night. That is really amazing to me." But we were the lightning rod. I mean, and then it was then that we began, like I got some hate letters. Bristow, when we all got hate letters, we got anonymous phone calls. But those were the cranks, you know, the people who, like the man who came to the school. Well, all of them weren't. Some were, you know.
Serious?
Yeah, no, I don't think ever serious. Well, one of my colleagues moved into that, bought the house 2 doors up. And the people that lived here at that time, the Mosleys, well, I found out later from the people that sold them the house that a number of the neighbors tried to get enough money together to buy the house so to keep the Hoffmans from moving there. And they thought I put the Hoffmans up to buying that house. I didn't. Billy found the house. In fact, I told him, I said, I think it's overpriced, Billy. As it turned out, it wasn't, because they stayed there long enough. Real estate went up. But anyway, Mr. Mosley told the people that sold him the house that the day those niggers moved in, he was going to shoot them. Well, it just about scared me to death.
This is your neighbor
right here. Well, he'd had a mild stroke a year before, and he was flaky, and so I thought, my God, he might do it. I knew Mrs. Mosley wouldn't, huh?
Not enough oxygen to the brain.
Right. And so I told Bristow and a couple of people at TAP, and we got a lot of people to come and go all day and help them move. All of us just terrified. I mean, you don't do these things and think, oh, well, this is the right thing to do. I mean, you can't do otherwise, but God Almighty, we were scared. And we never told Billy till later. Well, hell, Mr. Mosley didn't show himself all day long. Whether Ms. Mosley had him tied up in the house or not, I don't know. But do you know that was one summer? The next summer, Billy and Scarlett were very fastidious. Billy loved his car better than his children, and Billy washed his car every Saturday. He kept his grass mowed. He just did that. Well, they were so impressed.
Right.
You know?
They were going to come in here and have pigs in the front yard or something.
The next summer, the Mosleys had never asked me to keep their house key when they went on vacation. They left their house key with Billy and Scarlett. Yeah. And did it from then on. It is. It is. So it was an interesting.
I just missed just kind of a little formally. How did the two of you get from the school to TAP?
Oh yes.
How did that
now enter the scene. E. Cabell Brand. Have you heard of E. Cabell Brand?
Read a little bit about him.
Well, E. Cabell Brand is of the Virginia Cabell family. He's a real patrician. Went to VMI. He had, probably still, he posted the highest academic and all records at VMI that anybody ever did. He was head of the Cadet Corps. He served in World War II with the, not the CIA, but the, was it OSS?
Yeah, the OSS. Yeah.
I mean, had a distinguished career. He came back. His father owned the shoe company, mail order shoe company. He went with the State Department, and his father got sick and needed him, so he left that career, which he always knows that there was something he could have done in life different. And I think a lot of what he did here was to compensate for the fact he didn't do the State Department thing. I don't know how he got this way, but he has always seen the world as a whole. That's why he wanted to go in the State Department. That's why it's to bring peace has driven him. I guess what he saw in World War II, because I've known him since '65, and only just in the last year or so we were talking, and he talked some about some of the experiences he had in World War II. But his driver was shot and killed in a Jeep. And Cabell was safe, didn't get killed. And I think that's the driving thing. He was a liberal. I mean, Cabell has always been, I hate using the word liberal, but I really don't like that word because it doesn't really describe. Cabell came back here. He sees a product of here, grew up here, was a member of the upper crust. Cabell just declared himself, and he was looking for something to stand on. And he belonged to the Torch Club. You know what the Torch Club is? I guess it's still in existence. It was at that time a group of men, usually men in the businessmen, who would get together once a month. One would present a paper on something enlightening and intellectual, and then they'd discuss it. And Bristow and Cabell got to know each other and were friends in the Torch Club. Well, Cabell at that time was taking the Federal Register. He took a speed reading course about that time and was reading about 10 newspapers a day. I mean, he's a certified, he's a bona fide genius. His capacity to retain, he is, let me see, Cabell is 68 years old. And I said to Ted Edlick not long ago, I said, Ted, do you see that Cabell slowed down any? Ted thought, he said, no. I said, me either. I've told Cabell many times he'd kill me. I can't see him but ever so often. Oh, I'm serious. So Cabell read about this OEO legislation, the War on Poverty.
In the Federal Register.
And Cabell says, God, he said, this sounds like a wonderful thing. So he talked to Dave Herbert, who was head of the Roanoke Valley Council of Community Services at that time. He said, Dave, have you heard about this? And Dave said, no. So he got Dave a copy, and they talked about it, and Cabell said, it's my turn to do a paper at the Torch Club. He said, I'm going to do it on the War on Poverty legislation. So he did. And this one guy in the Torch Club who was the bellwether for conservatism. I mean, if he was against it, you knew you were for it. Well, this guy just hit the ceiling when Cabell did his paper that night. Dominated the conversation, went crazy. Cabell said he and Bristow and Dave Herbert walked out of that meeting, and Cabell said, we've got to have us a community action agency in Roanoke. He took a month off from his job, maybe 3 months. I think he took the whole summer off. And he and Dave and a couple of others, Bristow was off in Florida at a seminar on racism put on by the University of Florida at Gainesville.
He's still a
Principal.
and everything.
And they went everywhere, to every town, county. They went everywhere talking about the OEO and the Community Action Agency, and they applied for a Head Start grant, which they got, and then they got that. That gave them enough money to hire a couple of people, and that's when I got hired. They interviewed. I don't know how many applications they had for the executive director, but anyway, Bristow was the one they picked. And so then Bristow, I wasn't going to come because I felt like West End was too important if both of us left. At the same time, it'd be really hard on those kids. Well, he and Sam Baroni and Osborne Payne, the three people they hired, came to my house, and they just wore me down. I said, all right, I will come. I said, I don't have any idea what it is. Bristow said, don't worry, we don't either. I mean, here were 4 people hired. We knew it was easy to understand the daycare center, the daycare Head Start idea. I mean, that was simple to understand. But this thing, by this time, OEO had put out these workbooks, what a description of how to start a community action agency. I remember, like, I'd been there a week or so, and Bristow called me, he said, because it talked about building blocks, that the money from from OEO, is the first building block, and then you get other things. Well, this was a new concept.
Yeah.
The whole 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 board, remember, it was a new concept. And I remember Bristow called me about 10 days after I was hired, and he said, I've got it. He said, I finally understand the building block. From that moment on, Bristow had a clear vision of where to go.
Wow.
Now, not all the particular programs, but he knew how. So then we began developing. We developed a planning grant, and then this, the big operation grant, and we went to Washington to GW, met with some consultants that OEO put us in touch with that helped us think through it and decide what the ingredients ought to be. And so the first time we added up all the budgets, it was $2.3 million.
Wow.
And OEO had said, Roanoke, according to population and all the formula, should get about $700,000. Bristow called and said, there's no way. He said, I'm not interested in this job, $700,000 program. He said, that'd be an embarrassment. It wouldn't scratch the surface. Oh, no chance. So then we worked them again. Every time we'd rework the programs in the budget, honest to God, it would come out to $2.3 million. And so we didn't. Bristow and Sam and Osborne drove to Washington because you had to take 7 copies. And I swear to you, it's this tall.
Right.
That's the kind of proposals you wrote in those days.
Still do, unfortunately.
And they drove to Washington, hand-delivered it, and then we waited about 5 months. And Cabell was chairman of the board, president of the board. Cabell was calling saying, Bristow, are you sure you're doing everything you can to get funded? And Bristow said, you can call. I said, do anything you know. And finally they called and said, we've decided to give you $2.3 million.
Wow.
And Bristow looked at me and said, when he put the phone down, he said, oh my God. He said, there's this joke he used to tell about a little boy in the red wagon. Anyway, the punchline was, good God, what do I do now? And Bristow looked at me and said, good God, what do I do now? He said, how do we spend $2.3 million? Well, I'll never know where this came from in me. I said, $1 at a time. It's no problem. And very carefully. And so that's how we got into it. I mean, we didn't know, but neither did anybody else. Except Bristow and Cabell both had a vision far beyond what I had or anybody else had. They really did. But we used to tease Cabell and say, yeah, Cabell, we know you. Today, the Roanoke Valley. Tomorrow, Virginia. Next week, United States. And next month, the world. A joke. Cabell said, that's exactly right. So that's why we've had an international interest. And always seen, Cabell has traveled the world many times. Even in those days when he traveled, like during Watts, Cabell, if he had a business trip to California, he'd go straight to the top of the mayor's office and say, I want somebody to take me to Watts. I want to talk to the people. I remember he got an audience with Haile Selassie when he was in Ethiopia. He got an audience with the Leakeys when he went. He also has this big anthropological interest. Worldview. He belongs to all the world. What's the group down in Texas that the World Environmental Group with headquarters in Texas? I mean, but Bristow said, we are writing the textbooks on poverty.
So he was aware of that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Just one quick.
And we can afford to make mistakes. Thank God they gave us enough money to make mistakes.
The paper that was presented at Forest Club, do you recall what year that was? When that was?
It was in 1964.
1964. Okay. That must have been fascinating.
And so you probably when you got the
65.
65
Grant
is
came in
when the
65.
grant.
So you all worked pretty quickly after that.
Oh, it may have been the legislation was passed in 64, so it was probably the fall of 64 when he presented it. And then they submitted and got the applications in by April and were funded in 1st of July. Oh, you have to know Cabell to understand that. He probably thinks they wasted a lot of time. First time I met him, I had met him socially, but as a working person. He came charging in our office all I had was a desk and a telephone and a chair. We eventually got all of our furniture from one of the law firms here, Old Furniture. Because of Cabell's connections and Bristow's, they were able to get the support of a lot of important people in town who were liberals to moderate to liberals. But Cabell came charging in first time after I was hired. Get me so-and-so at the White House on the phone. Tell them Cabell's brand's calling. I said to myself, and then he charged out into Bristow's office, closed the door. I said, oh my God, how do you call the White House? Can you call the White House? I'm serious. I said, what do? I can remember my hands just perspiring, so I called the operator and I said, could you give me the number for the White House in Washington? And she said, could you tell me the address? Well, I could remember, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Just like that, she gave it to me. So I called, and I said, I'm calling for Mr. Cabell Brand in Salem, Virginia. Is Mr. So-and-so in? Just 1 minute. I said, oh, my God, I didn't know you could do this.
Again, this is sort of a retrospective question, but and as you talk, I think it probably quite clear. It sounds like the fact that this fellow was quite a prominent individual in the community.
Very.
And a prominent individual in the community who also was it sounds like he's incredibly bright and energetic.
Oh,
took interest in this. I mean, could it have happened without that? Would it have happened later, do you think, anyway, or
well,
possibly?
It did happen in other communities all over the country. 900, over 1,000 caps were created. Of course, the North Carolina Fund was a prototype for community action agencies, and that had a lot of intellectual prowess behind it too. The one that started in Richmond was, the first director was Wes Hare, who then came to North Carolina.
Yeah. Oh, I know him.
You know Wes.
Oh, yeah. We
And
went to Belize together. We spent
Wes took the job with one understanding from the beginning, that he would only stay long. The only reason he took it was because they said they had to have a white person to head it up to start with, because Richmond was in a very transitional period. It wasn't as transitioned completely, but it was clear. The board didn't want it to be a black-only agency, but Wes said, "I'll take it." But he said, "I'll take it and stay until I can train somebody, a black, to be the director." And he did. I don't remember if he stayed 3 years. I've forgotten how long. Oh yeah, I knew him real well in those days. So, in the communities where you had the strongest agencies, there was either a Cabell Brand and I think in all of them, to get them created, I'd say there was some prominent people behind it. They shot over our outreach workers' heads in their cars. Oh, that was a Klan. I mean, the Klan was active in those days. Down in Southwest Virginia, it was even worse. The Maryknoll sisters and the Appalachian, what were they called?
Vista Volunteers?
No, before Vista, pre-Vista. Like Vista, but much more radical than Vista.
Yeah, I forget.
You
I'm
know.
going to interview somebody who was one of
Yeah.
those. I forget.
Oh, now they really took because upsetting the status quo in Roanoke is one thing, but I tell you, upsetting it in a place like Washington County, Virginia, where even today, not Washington County, but 2 other counties in Southwest Virginia, they are so paranoid. One is always Republican and one's always Democrat controlled. That one of them, within the last 4 years, really and truly believed, and told somebody I know well, that they believe that the other county has guns stored along the county line. You know, that they're really going to invade and take them over. Oh no, I mean, the risks, the people who really took the risks, in my experience, during those days, were in Appalachia, but especially in that part. And the interesting thing is that a lot of good old boys, truly ignorant, controlled everything, controlled the government, the electorate in those days, but they were smart enough to fully understand the threat to their power. Whereas in places like Roanoke, it took a while for...
You'd already gotten in on the ground floor before they figured out what you were up to. This name, Total Action Against Poverty, I mean, that's a...
I know, it's a terrible name, right?
Well, but it's also interesting. I mean,
that was Cabell.
That's what I was wondering whether.
That's Cabell.
I mean, it's just like it's not grandiose. It's not really radical.
It's Cabell.
It's kind of radical, but it is.
It's Cabell.
It is a kind of larger than life name for a community.
And he's going to be really mad if he dies before poverty is erased from the world.
Does his moral sensibility come out of the same sort of Judeo-Christian tradition that you talked about?
Yes, it does. Definitely. But it also, you know how some people who live in small towns, because he grew up in Salem, which is different. Salem is older and more southern. Roanoke's not a southern city.
It's more of a New South town.
Right. You know how every now and then somebody just completely transcends their family, their culture, and just have this worldview of what Cabell has seen from the beginning, and God knows, I don't know, I do not know when he first saw it, but he fully understands that the poverty in the world, everywhere, limits the growth of people everywhere. And that the cruelty in the world hurts everybody. He's also very practical, a problem solver. I mean, that's the other thing is he just sees it, it's solvable, and why in the hell can't we build the public support for it?
He started this business, I mean, or kind of took this family business and kind of restructured it.
Oh, yeah, made lots and lots of money, and sold it.
He is one of these kind of almost, not like a Ross Perot, but he is one of these kind of...
Yeah, he's definitely
kind of
entrepreneur.
Who likes to make things happen.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. But you asked me a question, would it have happened? In the Shenandoah Valley, it didn't happen. Nobody rose up fast enough, and by the time there was a group there that was asking us to come help them start one, OEO had, the funds were limited, they wouldn't start anymore. In Virginia, 1/3 of the counties didn't have a cap by the cutoff time. Now the state and the feds have put more money in gradually, and those caps that exist have branched out. I'm not even sure the whole state is covered now. I think the state of North Carolina is fully covered. Some states got fully covered in the beginning. I don't know how they did it.
Did this notion of, we're going to talk to Dick Boone in a few weeks, who's worked in the White House or in OEO or somebody who's one of the people who dreamed up this idea of maximal participation.
Yeah, maximum feasible participation.
How did you try to implement that here, and what did that mean in terms of? Because that really was an extremely
radical.
That was really a radical idea.
Well, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 on the boards, which was the first way we started that.
Yeah.
And to get the money, you had to do it. There were certain things you had to do to get the federal money, and the federal money bypassed the governor's office in those days.
That's right.
Now, they had a sign-off, but after 30 days, if the governor didn't sign off, they sent the money anyway. I'd say, though, the way TAP started was with the board, but with the full understanding that that would be the norm for everything we did. Like with the Head Start Center, the parental involvement We did all kinds of workshop with newsprint, with both board members, with parents. The one thing TAP didn't do that a lot of other agencies did, which I don't know how much of that's still going on. We organized a lot of neighborhood groups, rural and urban. Mm-hmm. We did not do this big one-day election for board membership and membership on those like a lot of them did. I can't remember exactly why we didn't. I can remember what I remember, and that is that Bristow felt that in some ways that was phony. Because you never go, you only got so many neighborhood groups organized. And now they had their own boards, and they elected their membership. And then we had like 20, because at one time we had 36 board members, so 12. 12 were those neighborhood groups who elected their own representative to the TAP board. But Bristow felt that voter registration was more important. Voting in real elections was more important than, he was always, when he was at West End School, he mainlined. He was the first person to mainstream children who were physically and the special education classes. He really believed in mainstreaming. And so there was that bias he brought that I bought into. And I think Cabell did too, and others. But you ought to talk to somebody where they did do that, because they may have it may have worked really great. Yeah. But Cabell treats people with dignity too. And so the members of the board, in the early days, the representatives from those neighborhood groups were given a half-a-day training session before each board meeting to go over the agenda so they could ask questions because many of them, of course, some of them were ministers, who knew Robert's rules, so it wasn't like they were all like that. Right. So there was a mix. Right. But there were enough of them who really were poor, and this is their first opportunity, first time exposure to how to participate in a meeting and how to be heard and how to be persistent if necessary. And so, we just spent hours and hours and hours, I've forgotten about it, in workshops, meetings, the development of proposals, the Head Start proposals, the Head Start parents spent probably 2 or 3 days going through that process of what were the objectives. Then the neighborhood group representatives, we did that with the other. Yeah, we did that for a number of years. We don't do that anymore. But the board does, like TAP's board. And what we saw pretty soon, I don't remember how long it took to see, that the people representing the neighborhood groups were the most they were contributing the most to the board. They never missed meetings. Once they learned they could speak and people would listen to them, they loved it. Then after Kennedy and Martin Luther King were killed, though, when in Washington, all the burning of the cities, went through a real hard time then. That was a real hard time.
Just because of the racial tension on the board?
Not just the board, but in the staff. The day after Martin Luther King was killed, I went to the office so distraught. Black people didn't speak to me. Really? I've known these folks now for, when was he killed? 68? Yeah, so 4 years. 3, yeah, and I couldn't believe it. And then I realized, they were so hurt, they felt betrayed. Every white person was guilty. Yeah. And so Bristow was in Atlanta to a OEO conference. So he called and said that they were all staying down there for the funeral. So Jim Stamper, the deputy, and I decided we'd have everybody bring TVs in for to watch TV together and watch the funeral together. We just closed the doors. And that helped more than anything. But just the anger, that's when, the Black Power movement rose, the anger of the blacks. There's somebody I wish you had time to meet, a guy named Ivory Morton. He's not rural. But he was the leader of this hostile, angry black group. He was about 19, 20 years old. And in those days, we had enough money to pay the rent, to rent some different places so these groups we could pay the electricity, the rent, the water, and
they had their own offices.
Yeah, and their meeting places.
Yeah.
But sometimes not a staff. It was like just volunteers, and so we'd rented this place in one of the black parts of town, and they called it the Black House, and it belonged to them. And they called Bristow one day and said, "We want you and Mr. Stanford to come for a meeting. We want to talk about some of the things we want to do." It was the day of the Chicago Convention, because we were all going to the Stampers for dinner that night. Well, Bristow and Jim didn't come. About 9:30 they arrived, and Bristow, they were just bugged out. Those young black men had held them at knife point, making demands on Bristow. Like, you're going to do this and you're going to do that. Ivory was the ringleader. And Bristow said, "I'm sorry, I don't have the money. I'll tell you what we can do. We'll talk about it and see if we can get a couple of staff people. But I can't do it." And Bristow just, he didn't panic. So finally they let him go with the agreement they'd meet again later in the week. Well, Ivory, from that day, became Bristow's most loyal, ardent supporters, friends, fans. He said, "He's the first white man that never lied to me." And he's still one of my best friends. And he went to work for the school system. Bristow got him into Hollins College he's got artistic inclinations. He did some drama there, but he just simply either couldn't, wouldn't, whatever, do the academic stuff. It was too much for him. I don't mean too much here, because that isn't it. It was just keeping it all together at that time in history for him. But he went to work for the school system, I don't know how long ago, since before Bristow died, doing maintenance work. But he's good at it. But his big thing is he befriends all the poor and the homeless and the black students, especially in the elementary schools. He encourages the young to stay away from drugs, and he's just a wonderful influence, and just turned out so good. And he always knows what's going on in the community. And he told me not long ago, he's by the office, and he said, "Wilma," he said, "you remember what it was like in the 60s? I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "I know that was scary for some of you white folks." I said, "It was." But actually, I was never scared of them. But he said, "I want you to know," he said, "I don't walk the streets of a lot of parts of Roanoke now at night because of the drug." He said, "Drugs makes these kids crazy, and the guns."
Put the two of them together. How about poor whites and poor blacks? What was that related? And say in these early years,
Oh God, it was wonderful.
Spirit of the thing was that. That would
You're asking questions that I'd forgotten about.
And that would be where people would have expected the conflict to come. They would say, "Well, you and Apple can, you can work with these poor black people or these poor white people. When you bring them together, that's what's really threatening or problematic." How did that?
Well, we got the same group, the group at George Washington University that consulted us, told us about this other firm, a private firm called University Trainers. In fact, some of the trainers also taught at GW, who did experiential education. So Bristow had written in training money, lots of it. That was one of the big bones of contention. And Bristow said, I'm not taking the money unless you give me the training money, because we don't know what we're doing. So they came in on a contract. They stayed a year and a half, I think. And we did a lot of group stuff and talking about race and how we feel, focused on ourselves. Every one of us on the staff, no matter what the job, was assigned to a neighborhood. And not everybody on a team, like I had a black neighborhood, but I had also a black person. So the teams were sort of integrated. It was not really scary for whites to go into black communities that time as it was for blacks to go into white communities, the poor white communities. And so when they went into Southeast, we were nervous about that. As it turned out, there may have been some minor incidences like kids would do, but no really scary, dangerous experiences. And it really was surprising, amazing to me, how little conflict that caused. But like if they went knocking on doors, it'd be a black and a white together. And most of the workers were hired out of their neighborhoods. So if they were in Southeast, it'd be somebody from Southeast, a white worker who had a black person. And a lot of our early workers were also black clergymen. A lot of our white employees in the beginning were white clergymen. The white ones were ones that had either been kicked out of their church or were on the verge because of their stand on race. And that's what happened. The present director of TAP, Ted Edley, he was a Presbyterian minister in a rural area. So we talked a lot about it. God, it was crazy in those days. I mean, I had 4 kids and a husband. I mean, when I came home at night, I finally reached very early the point. I said, do not call me at home. Nobody. I'm not going to talk on the phone at night. I can't, it's just so hyper. And everybody's so intense. And it was fun, but, I couldn't take that. But a lot of them could. And they'd get together at night, and they'd just go on. And it was like college sophomores. But important. Important.
That's real stuff.
Yeah. And so it happened. I think the big thing was the getting to know you. Oh, that's when I first learned, when I first went to TAP, there was a large middle class and upper middle class black community in the city of Roanoke. I didn't know that. I didn't know these people. Lots and lots of college graduates who had a wonderful social life. They invited us to their dances. It was just great. I mean, what an enriching experience it was. And freeing, And, but there were flare-ups here and there all the time.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
There was one rule Bristow had, absolute, no exceptions. If he found out anybody brought drugs of any kind on the premises, you're fired. Because he knew that could be the death knell for the agency with the people who wanted it to die. And I mean, that was just an absolute rule. No drinking in the building. Not that he was opposed. He wasn't much of a drinker, but it wasn't. It was just the image. He understood the importance of those kind of messages, because the word was that we had these sex orgies,
Right.
drug and sex orgies. And I said, God, little do they know I go home every night so beat down to work another 5 hours taking care of my family.
Right.
But, and the word was in the early days that Cabell Brand was making $40,000 a year from TAP, which, of course, he wasn't. Bristow, at the most, when he died in 1975, was making $26,000.
Nobody
And Cabell wasn't paid anything, of course. As a board, But there was definitely a very conservative element in the community, and some pretty powerful people who wished we would die and go away. But they aren't like that anymore. There's still some, but most people now, see, I'm honored for all I've done for the Commonwealth of Virginia, you know. But that's because a lot of time has gone by. In the early days, now my neighbors all stayed friendly to me, and they were nice to my children. But as time went on, I gradually saw, interesting to me, the women of the neighborhood would begin to say to me, you know, you really are lucky. You are so lucky that you get to travel. I wish I had gone to work. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I didn't do it because I wanted to do anything good. I did it because I had to earn a salary. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't begrudging. Mm-hmm. It was just a recognition there's a new world. Yeah. And I think, basically, how I really feel. See, I think fear and love, or whatever the word for that is, are the two basic emotions that we have. Mm-hmm. And I think fear causes us to do some very ignoble things. And that where at the moment I would get mad as hell, you know, especially at the good old boys, you know, and like to just wipe them off the face of the earth, I always knew they were afraid of change. Mm-hmm. Just that fear of the unknown, fear of the unknown. And then gradually I began to see that for whatever reasons, I have never been afraid of that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's no credit to me. You know, it's just that's the way you are. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, my parents probably shaped it, but the fact is I've never been afraid of change. In fact, I think it's exciting. I love exotic places and people. And I always sort of thought people who were afraid of change were crippled in a way. Mm-hmm.
Certainly limiting.
Yeah. And, but see, as change comes and it gets safe, then a lot of people say, oh, yeah, I like this. This is good.
I remember reading somewhere that in the beginning of the water projects.
Cindy, could you answer that and take a message, please?
You were talking to somebody who was objecting to providing water to people that didn't have it. He said, well, you know, for 17 years or whatever, my family did it this way and whatnot. And it struck me that same thing about,
right.
I mean, who in their right mind in some ways would object to having water be available to people? But on the other hand, it's part of this tradition. A tradition is that double-edged thing in some ways. It provides continuity and strength and cohesiveness on the one hand, but it also can be incredibly limiting,
right,
and short-sighted on the other hand.
Definitely. The interesting thing is, no woman ever said to me, you know, why do you think those poor people and rural people want water? No urban woman, no country woman, no woman. It was always men who didn't have to boil the water, didn't have to carry. Oh, this one guy said, you know, he said, I used to carry water for my mother every day. I said, yeah, when you did that, the spring or stream you carried it from was crystal clear, safe to drink. I said, you can't find one anymore like that. And, but it's because as a kid carrying water, he had no way of knowing how hard his mother worked to keep the family going and their clothes clean. Because we can't experience something we haven't experienced. So, yeah, I got a lot. But even he worked for Farmers Home Administration. And that's the most hidebound bureaucracy that there's nothing in the communist system, there's nothing anywhere that's more hidebound than the Farmers Home Administration bureaucracy. And so I think they have a secret subliminal test they give to people they hire for looking for people who just resist change as hard as they can. And so basically I really think that's what it was. He was resisting change.
Well, you were talking earlier sort of about the program that you all developed and this notion of maximum participation and training and teaching people how to be effective in meetings and the local leaders and whatnot. I mean, that was a fundamental component of what were you doing. How did sort of programmatically, what did you focus on first? I mean, what were you trying to get, and then how did you kind of evolve it into what it became? What were the...
Well, we did two different kinds of training at the same time. The training that the university trainers, university associates did was they were hired to train staff. That was much more in depth in the early days because we did a lot of personal growth, team building, design skills. In fact, we started our own training nonprofit, which we still have, to train staff. A lot more in depth. Then, but we did a lot of TAP. Now I'm talking TAP.
Yeah.
Once we had a training component for 10 years or more, 15. See, Nixon I don't mean Nixon, Reagan, really, I mean just gutted all the good stuff out. And we did training for the local welfare department to train their workers to be more sensitive to poor people. It was great. I mean, and as a result of that, the woman who then was the assistant director of the one in the city became the director. And when Reagan came in, she always had the right responses anyway, but she got a lot of skills she didn't have. She was one of the most articulate defenders of TAP during the days when it looked like TAP and all of us might go down right down the tubes in 81, 82. We trained, the TAP trainers got a contract, got paid to train garbage workers in Roanoke County to improve their self-image, to help them. The guy in charge was just an unusual guy. I mean, you just can't imagine a guy who'd pay money to hire his trainers. He thought he had the best damn bunch of garbage workers in the world. And he wanted to, one, let them have some training to help them appreciate how good they were, but also to increase, because they had developed teams, each truck had a team, to give them some more real skills on teamwork. And then he was willing to put an incentive program in, which was unheard of, is that if they finished at 10 o'clock in the morning, they could go home, but get paid for a full 8 hours. And so we did that kind of training. We trained other community action agency staff. We trained, some church people. I'm trying to think what other institute. Oh, social service. Well, big social service. Then, and still are doing training of the Department of Corrections. See, TAP started, Virginia Water Project's just the first of 4 statewide nonprofits that they've created. TAP isn't unusual. TAP is, if not the best, certainly one of the top CAP agencies in the country, especially for starting programs that go beyond the usual kind of stuff. No, the second one was Virginia Cares, which is the Virginia Reentry Action, Reentry something. I can never remember, but it's for people that are getting ready to come out of the state prison system. They get training inside, they get training outside, they get help with getting work, they get follow-up sessions. When they're in, they take their arrange transportation for the families to come to visit. But they give them real skills on how to deal with conflict. without getting angry, without, they make them, and they're tough. I mean, geez, they're so tough. I mean,
Really?
oh yeah, I mean, they don't let them caught them about anything. Most of the people are women, black and white. Yeah, they just go right in those.
Prison groups they're a tough group. I mean, I've never met a more sort of self-righteous group. They're certain that they are right, and the reason they got in there is because other people are somehow wrong. And they're a tough group to work with sometimes.
And they've been very effective. Their recidivism rate is less than half the state norm. Those that have been in their program, that compared to the others who haven't been, control groups, less than half. Maybe far less than half. I haven't seen any recent numbers, but used to be something like 70-some% was the state norm, and theirs was 32 or something. And then the next one is called Project Discovery. Nearly all of these, like Virginia Cares, came out of Ted Edlick's mind and a woman named Lynn Atkins, largely. This third one, Project Discovery, came out of Cabell's mind. Cabell believes the solution to all problems in the world is education, of one form or another. And that Cabell sees human ignorance as the enemy of the world. And that is a program for first-time college-bound, actually minority first-bound college. It was a response to Virginia's lack of ability or lack of action to get minorities enrolled in colleges. And so it's sold just like that to the State Board of Education because they were under, court order. And it works. It really works. And they started out with high school sophomores. I think now they're working with starting with 7th graders, beginning to enroll kids, taking them to spend weekends on campuses, taking them through the whole process of getting ready for the SATs, involving their families. And what they found is the big barrier to most of these kids going to college is that the parents never thought it was possible. Financially.
And also a lot of them had no vision of
No.
that as a way of life.
What it was like, never been on a college campus. Nobody in the family had ever graduated from college, ever gone to college. That's a wildly successful program. And it's been picked up by about 5 other states, and I think they're working in Hawaii to start one there. That's been gotten the largest amount of money from state government of any of our programs. See, they've created a network.
Right.
I don't know how many there are, 9 or 10, 12, through community action agencies, locally operated. And it's something easy for any politician to support. See, water is easy. We had good. Virginia Cares has had the hardest time because hadn't been easy to get politicians to support. Took longer, but they have good solid support. And the latest one is called CHIP, which is Comprehensive Health Improvement Program, something like that. And that's for kids, I've forgotten what ages, 3 to 12 or something like that, whose families are not poor enough to get on Medicaid. I mean, there's some cutoff limit, but who really have no access to health care. Families can't afford insurance. And many of those families had gotten all of their medical care from emergency rooms. So they wait till something got to emergency. And that has tremendous support from the state health department. And they've got like a multi-million-dollar Kellogg grant to expand that statewide.
So you've been really out of this
Virginia
town here, and you've really been able to expand all these things at statewide. So in some ways you've become almost kind of a statewide community action.
We are. That's what we're called.
Yeah.
Each of the 4 are called statewide community action.
Yeah. So it had their genesis here.
Right.
It's local.
Right. And the contribution that Virginia, probably the biggest contribution I made to that was that all those dining room table conversations about politics really paid off. I discovered when I began to go talking to politicians about getting money for TAP, I'd be scared to death the first few times. I think, God, they don't even want to see me. How easy it was, how easy it was to get support. So then when I became the director of the water project, we began working in Richmond. And, oh, God, I'd be so scared. And then they'd say, why, yes, well, of course we'll support that. And I organized the CAPs to each CAP. Did a survey on what their local water access needs were. And then go to their member of the General Assembly, Senate and delegate, take with them a nice little packet and show them and tell them about where these people are and ask them if they'll support the Virginia Water Project legislation, the seed fund. Well, this was in 78 we started. What I discovered is that many of the CAP directors did not, especially rural, some urban, didn't know who their members of the General Assembly were. They had thought of themselves so on the outside. And their response to me was, they won't even let me in their office. I said, try it. So we set up like a headquarters, an election headquarters, big things up. And they called in, reported in. We did everything we could, sent them lists of names and telephone, made it easy as we could for them. But they had to make the calls. They had to do the talking. And also to send some of their outreach workers, because, I found outreach workers are the most impressive people, because they're right in the line.
Yeah.
Well, they just were overjoyed. They said, they called me, they said, well, Senator so-and-so said he really thanked me for coming to see him. He didn't know these people were in his district had this problem. And so we were the first to really build a political network. That's what it was. But on a subject of water, which is so non-threatening. And we got money the first year we went, which was unheard of, to get new money first year you go in Virginia. And so that same methodology then, what we did was train the CAP directors and their staff how to go to the General Assembly without being an enemy of the electorate, of the elected officials, but to inform them and to get their help on a problem in their district. And my God, it just worked like a charm. We got a group in North Carolina working on that process now. Gloria Williams and the Orange, yeah, but it's going for money for their North Carolina water project. Yeah. When we were lucky the first year, we had Roanoke senator was the number 2 guy on the Senate Finance Committee, Bill Hopkins, and he was familiar. He, knew me and knew about our project. In fact, he had done some legal work for some of the early water projects, pro bono. And we almost lost the money, and Cabell called him and said, can Wilma come over and talk to you on a Saturday afternoon? I went over and told him the problem. He's such a darling man. He said, well, Wilma, he headed up this commission called the Hopkins Commission to reform the management, the administration. And the major thing they recommended was put in a computer system for the General Assembly, which they had done. And that was the first year it was operative. He said, well, Wilma, he said, we were asking for $250,000. He said, under normal circumstances, he said, $250,000. He said, I could have found that for you last year without any big problem. But he said, they got me to do this study commission, and we recommended putting in these computers. And he said, before this year, he said, the chairman and I were the only ones in the General Assembly at the end of the day who knew where the money was. He said, now every son of a bitch in the General Assembly knows where the money is, so it's harder to find any unspoken for. He said, but I think I can find you $100,000. He said, would that do this year? I said, that would do just fine. Every son of a bitch in the General Assembly.
Yeah, losing power.
But she had a great sense of humor about it.
One of the questions that I think has emerged, I think, and we've done about, this is I guess our third or fourth interview, that's emerged. Les Dunbar, for example, said it comes back to perhaps the lack of kind of an overall spirit of goodwill for this sort of work. That in the nation we don't seem to somehow have the kind of collective compassion or whatever.
It's the big heartbreak of my life.
Now, and he sort of said, there's nothing wrong with building a rural health clinic, and it's good to treat people. There's nothing wrong with doing this project or that project. And, if I think about my work overseas, there's a lot of good singular community development projects, but they've never formed the kind of aggregate to make any kind of fundamental or structural difference. Now, it sounds to me, and in looking at some of the numbers and the amounts of families that you read, that this is the genesis. I mean, there's a beginning here of something. You've somehow been able to use water, which is a kind of a less threatening political issue, to do a bunch
It's more than less threatening. It induces guilt to be against it.
To achieve more neutral than,
See, I mean, people, well, one member of the House told me when I went to him the first time, I didn't think, I couldn't tell from his face if he was even listening to me. When I finished, I said, and Senator Cantrell, I hope you'll be able to support this legislation. He leaned across the desk, he's a little man, bald, shiny head, and he said, Ms. Warren, he said, not only will I support your legislation, he said, I'd be ashamed of myself if I didn't. To be against people having safe drinking water. Go ahead.
No, but and that's intentional, emblematic of other things. Mm-hmm. But what have you? If you kind of look at what's worked about what you've done somehow, because I think the question is, I guess statistically, there's more poor people now in this country than there was 30 years.
That's right.
Per capita. Can you sort of distill any lessons for the rest of us in some ways in terms of what do we need to really make a significant difference in this country? We seem to be losing ground nationally.
Well, I am by nature an optimist. There have been times in my life when I had some serious problems that I should be worrying about 24 hours a day, and I'd get distracted and forget to worry. I mean, I'm serious. I am an optimist. But I have to say to you that until the millennium comes, and I don't say this out of a great religious belief in the Bible. I mean, I do believe, but this is not coming out of a literal translation of the Bible. Just my experience tells me we may never have a huge 75% of the population who are going to support this kind of program or things that are going to help low-income people. I tell you, the 80s was a miserable decade for me. Not just because we were in threat of losing our funding and everything that we believed in going down the tubes, but it was how stupid the American people were to respond the way they did to Ronald Reagan, to really believe we could have it all and not have to pay for it, ever. How they wanted to believe that. And I think even now, most people don't realize, the cause and effect of where we are now.
Right.
I really don't think they do. And I don't mean this in that I'm so much smarter than anybody. I mean, I viewed this with horror. I've often thought that our work is like we have a telescope. And part of the time, I have to view the world out of with the little in here, and then see it magnified and see the whole global thing. The other part of me says that, but try to link people up who share a common cause as much as possible. But I've seen us get so optimistic and think, oh man, we finally made it, it's really going to happen. Well, in the state of Virginia, God, we elected Doug Wilder, who, if we hadn't had this damn budget shortfall, our agency would have doubled our money. Instead, we've lost $100,000 a year through things out of the good guys' control. It's almost as if there's this conspiracy against good in the world. I mean, if you want to believe in the theory of good versus evil, the great battle, God knows we witness it all the time. I think human greed is hard to beat. It's hard to beat. And if here this great-grandfatherly guy says, you don't have to help the poor, you don't have to pay higher taxes, you can get rich. Come on, let's all go to Pleasure Island with Pinocchio.
And then he gets some of the church and religious leaders back on the same.
That's right. And then let's have a couple skirmishes that make us feel really great about our
prowess.
right. So I'm pretty cynical. I hate it. I don't like being cynical. I'm pretty cynical about, and I don't let myself dwell on this. I mean, in this older middle-class woman beats the heart of a true radical. I mean, if I could I told Norman Collins with the Ford Foundation, who was our angel, who took over the Mexico office. We were talking on the phone shortly before he went, and we were talking about, the problems, especially they had huge water problems. And I had just seen that 60 Minutes program on the border where GM has their plants right across the border and paying those women $4 a day or something like that. Best money they ever had, but they still go back to the barrios at night. It's not enough money to get them out of the barrios to do those harnesses for the automobiles. I said, Norm, if I were younger and knew what I know now, I'd go down there and organize a union among those women. That's what I'd do. So if you want to know what I think there's a lot more radical behavior that has to take place. And really and truly, I think the solution to the unemployment, to the moving of jobs to the developing countries, is not to buy American. It is to organize those people to demand fair payment for so that it isn't going to benefit.
Make any difference, right?
Right. And
that's too bad the American labor movement hadn't understood that yet. They were supporting the CIA for years. Those little dictators in those little countries, so that they, now we just set them up. I mean,
that's right.
They impoverished the country. Now the factories can just move down there, and whatever his name is complaining about it. I mean, everything they've done for the last 20 years in terms of foreign policy is just
absolutely
created the conditions for that.
And I don't think it's an accident.
No.
I mean, I think that's how we got Ronald Reagan. I think he was groomed by that crowd. I think George Bush just right out of it. So I realized some time ago I'm not a normal Ray. And I might not be again, like if I were that age now. I'm not sure I have the courage, to just walk off and leave everything I have for. But I think we're going to need some more Norma Rays and some people who are willing in the developing countries. Norman Collins I think he was a little shocked. He said, wow, I said, I'm serious.
Yeah.
He said, well, you have a point. I said, I'm not kidding you. I think economic justice, paying workers is probably the single most important thing. But it's the only way I see to get at it. But in the meantime, I'm looking at the telescope the other way. I live in Virginia. I live in the South. And I do believe that I can't control, I'm not God, I can't control the future. What happens, let's say what we've done to help Ivanhoe or any of these other communities, we've helped them get their water. Let's say ask us back in for anything else. We don't, it's theirs.
Yeah.
We are facilitators, catalysts. We give them a little money. We help them point their noses into other places for resources. But what we've seen is that in many of those communities, then other development occurs, driven by those same leaders who rose up. And so I think for rural, God, don't even get me started on rural economic development. Two failures I see of the war on poverty and social scientists and, that whole genre of people, the anti-poverty. One is, except for a handful of CDCs and some others, I don't think anybody really knows what's going to bring about long-lasting, sustainable jobs that pay decent living in rural areas.
Yeah.
And that's what being put on that Center on Rural Development Board in Virginia is what really excites me, because that's where I was on this advisory committee. You all know the Aspen Institute. DeWitt John, they got a big grant from the Ford Foundation to do the state's role in rural economic development. And I was on that advisory committee. And that really opened my eyes. I think a lot of that thinking fits in with what the process they're talking about is the process we've used, is that the intermediaries like us are truly intermediaries. We don't go in and do but we do link people up. We link them to resources, link them to other people. But there's still, I keep saying, we've said to the staff, we had this many discussions, I've said to DeWitt, I said, but you do all that, at least we know with the water and wastewater, we're talking about either a well, a package plant, a water system. We know what the product is. The trouble with rural economic development is nobody spent enough time saying, what is the product? What are the products? What do we have to sell? And I think that's what the people themselves have to do. And, so I see our role as getting rural communities to really spend some time looking at what is the product. If we want jobs here, what do we have to sell?
Yeah.
I think if we don't do that, if we let rural communities die by attrition, well, one politician in Virginia said it. I didn't say this, but he said it more stronger than I would have said it. He said that in 15 years, if we don't figure out some way to bring jobs to rural Virginia west of Roanoke, it's going to be a welfare state. That's over-dramatic, but by far the biggest chunks of money are going to come from this federal, they're going to be subsidy monies in every way.
Be the alternative.
So that's one big issue I don't think has been, and those programs that have succeeded haven't been exposed. Others haven't seen them enough. I think, one thing out of this, what you all are doing, is not only to write it down and have the history, but if you could get Pew or somebody to give you as a follow-up money to pay to take people around to those that you see really work. Traveling money for people. And the other thing is, and I did see this I've said it for years and nobody's really paid any attention. In the early days of TAP, we and this is the how to prevent children having children. In the early days of TAP, this strange man and woman came to our office. I've forgotten, from the Midwest. He looked like a little professor. But he was going around the country, talking to agencies like that, us, trying to get Planned Parenthood, which is now called Planned Parenthood, organizations going. Well, Bristow said, this is wonderful. And that was part of our job. You know, we started all these other, like League of Older Americans was started by CAPS. Lots and lots of programs. The CDCs were largely created by CAPS. And so this little man said, I mean, he was very surreptitious, like he was a spy. And we thought, this is crazy. Well, Bristow said, some people I want you to talk to. So he did. So this little group of people said, yeah, we'd try to get one started. I think there was some money from the Fed. And, my God, the phone calls started coming in. That was probably the most radical thing we tried to do. It was from the Bible Belt people and from the Roman Catholic Church. And man, they were hot. That TAP was going to teach childbirth prevention. So anyway, though, this little group that spun off, they were dedicated and they got started, but my God, the same people have dogged them all these years. But to me, that's the biggest failure. And now you add AIDS to that, and drugs.
You spoke about your role as a facilitator. Now, one of the things that we're trying to facilitate, in addition to showing people what works and what doesn't work, is trying to facilitate some kind of communication to a younger generation of people, whether it's our students or a larger group of people. And one of the things we're trying to recapture and somehow transmit is a sense of responsibility and kind of excitement and mission to younger people who are.
Well, you got to go to Ivanhoe when the students are there. You know about Maxine's college program.
Yeah.
She had to turn away, I've forgotten, several hundred students for the spring break.
Oh, was that right?
Colleges all over the country have heard about Ivanhoe. Those kids are just calling her, banging on the door. So now what she's doing, that's our 5th statewide, is this, I don't know what they're going to call it, but is...
Yeah, we'll have to get more.
We've got a summer internship program. We send about 50 students every summer for, I guess it's about 8 or 9 weeks to work with, AIDS patients. Almost in New York, and we've got migrants in Florida and kind of poor kids in Washington. I just met with a group of them last night, actually.
I see hope. Now, the one place I don't feel pessimistic. I really feel optimistic about this emerging generation of kids. Big change. We see a big change. I don't know where it's coming from.
We confront, and I don't know, again, because I haven't taught except, in the late 80s and now in the 90s. What we confront is, and perhaps it's a bequeathment of the 80s, is that it's not an era that rewards compassion. It's an era that almost shames compassion in some way. And the voices they contend with are out of their own families, but also out of the community. As you're not being practical. Some parents actually will argue with their kids, don't spend your summer here and whatnot. And what we find is once they go do that, to put the hands in the wound, so to speak, their lives are changed.
Oh yeah.
And their lives, they cannot be the same in some ways.
And they will go against their family.
Yeah. In some cases they will. In some cases they.
Now, many of them that are doing that, I don't think necessarily are going to stay in anti-poverty work. But they are forever changed.
That's right.
See, we've had lots of interns, at Virginia Tech especially, to work with, like that Water for Tomorrow. We had 2 of the brightest young people working on that were just incredible. And they were both one was from Northern Virginia. We're both urban kids. And they forever changed about their viewpoint of rural communities, rural people.
Yeah, our baseline hope, I think, is that with
Absolutely.
experiences, at least when they go on and do whatever they do, they over
That's
there,
right.
and then on Saturday go down and work in the soup kitchen and feel good about what
Right.
or throw a dollar towards the homeless or whatever. That somehow they,
Well,
citizens, they may be changing.
there's an indication I've read about. I haven't seen a whole lot of it yet with my eyes. That yuppie generation is also appalling. Here they are 45, 40 something. And they've looked around and said, is this all that there is? And then a significant number of also who went through the great 80s and made all this easy money. Now the recession or depression has really hurt them. So I think that is happening. But I think there's nothing more important to do than to expose high school, but especially college-age kids to on a personal living in the community basis, both urban and rural. There is no question about it. I've seen it happen over and well, it's just. I mean, I cannot think, and it tapped over the years. See, we've had lots of college. See, we've got an abundance of colleges.
Yeah.
Virginia and North Carolina probably have more colleges per capita than any state.
There are a bunch, aren't there?
I've never known a youngster that wasn't changed. That didn't say, they didn't say it like this, but what they say is, I've never felt so alive. This is worth dying for. This is life. This is life. And I know they don't ever forget it.
I think the
But
other
with-
thing we need to do, though, I mean, one of the things that we've run up against in teaching is that we also have to impart some very practical and very particular lessons, so that it's not just a matter of developing some compassion, but we actually move
Focus it.
forward and focus them, and because they sometimes can't. They develop this compassion, and they get into this kind of 1,000 points of light mentality.
No.
It's okay as long as I feel good about it, and go work in the soup kitchen or do this, that, or the other.
Which can be a
then
cop-out.
Then I'm okay, and I'm doing my role, and what.
And don't
It's
see
just
that
kind
it's
of
all tied to
intellectually
a
have to-
political.
Yeah, when they've got to start looking at kind of the structural changes
Right.
that are and
Well, what-
understanding the impediment.
What Maxine does, and I'm sure she's not the only only place that does this. Every night, I mean, they have physical tasks in the daytime. She doesn't let them take but one bath a week. She rents outhouses. They cannot flush a stool while they're there. She makes them experience, and she said she thought the first group would just rebel and go home. Well, God, letter after letter, kids have said the most important thing I learned was what it feels like to go without water. I mean, but at nights, after they worked all day, at night she has a set curriculum of things they discuss and talk about.
Wow.
Like the oppression of women, the oppression of Appalachian people. I don't remember what all, but every night there's something there.
I haven't gotten all the information from her yet. So.
Well, she's on the wing all the time.
Yeah.
And see, she's gotten some national awards, and so she's getting known nationally, and
Yeah.
she's having a hard time turning down
Yeah.
things. And she wasn't going to participate in this, and she said, saw my name on the list, and she said, well, she'd do it because she gets a lot of,
Yeah.
I don't get this many. Hi, how are you?
I don't know, so-and-so